Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds admits herself to hospital amid escalating controversy over the government's handling of a staff rape complaint. A New South Wales inquiry contemplates coercive control laws, hearing harrowing accounts of victims shamed, humiliated and robbed of self-worth. And be alert, not alarmed. Former Prime Minister John Howard says woke culture has gone too far in Australia. But what does it actually mean to be woke? And joining me on our woke panel this evening, Director of Government Relations firm Chikarovsky and Associates and former New South Wales Liberal leader Kerry Chikarovsky. You're fresh back from 2 days in Canberra. How
yes,
was the mood?
Interesting place to be, Parliament House at the moment. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on and we're going to talk about some of it, but I think both sides of the House are deeply concerned about the culture in the place, and I think both sides of the House will be working out what they can do to improve it. Yes,
and we will get back to that very soon. Former police officer and lecturer at the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University, Vincent Hurley. Great to have you back again.
Thanks, Julia.
Executive Director of Change.org, Sally Rugg. Hey, Sally, from Melbourne.
Hi, Julia.
Hey, and in Perth, founder of Modest Fashion Australia and chair of Roots TV, Aisha Novakovic. Hey, Aisha.
Hi, Julia.
Great to see you. If you want to join in on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag The Drum, but not for now on Facebook. Now, today we were all set to report on Defence Minister Linda Reynolds' address to the National Press Club in front of a packed room full of journalists. Now, she's facing mounting criticism since the story of Brittany Higgins, the former Liberal staffer who was allegedly raped in her office 2 years ago, came to light. Now, however, this morning the speech was abruptly pulled and Linda Reynolds was admitted to a Canberra hospital.
Linda was desperate to appear before the National Press Club today, desperate to appear, and it was only on the strongest medical advice that she took the reluctant decision not to do it.
In a statement, the Defence Minister said she was acting on the advice of her cardiologist relating to a pre-existing medical condition. She'll now take a period of medical leave. Brittany Higgins said she intended to lodge a formal complaint with police today. And she did send a tweet wishing Linda Reynolds a speedy recovery and urging the government to improve the workplace culture in Parliament House. Now, for more on this, we are joined in Canberra by national political reporter at the Daily Telegraph, Claire Armstrong. Welcome back to The Drum, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's unusual to see this level of excitement and anticipation about an address at the press club. But much of this was obviously to do with the ability to ask questions at the end of it. Can you outline for viewers at home who might have lost track of this, what are the questions remaining about the way that Linda Reynolds responded to Brittany Higgins' case?
Yeah, well, I think actually to even backtrack from what are the questions, part of the reason why the press club address was so important today was no journalist has actually had an opportunity to ask any questions. Minister Reynolds has not fronted the media since the allegations went public. There have been a couple of statements from government spokespeople and she's been questioned on the floor of the Senate, but not in person by a journalist. So it was actually probably going to be all of the questions, but the ones that we still don't fully know are exactly when she became aware of the allegations and whether that was basically before or after that meeting was held in the same office where Brittany Higgins alleges that the sexual assault occurred. So that's really the issue. There's confusion around timelines, around when the AFP were involved, and around whether, the minister did tell others about the allegation, because no journalist has been able to put those questions to her directly yet.
And won't be able to for some time. Is there any expectation that any other, whether the Prime Minister or any other ministers might be able to shed light on this, or we're just going to wait for the inquiries, 4 of them now, to tell us how that process didn't work?
Yeah, I don't think there's an expectation that someone's going to step up in Minister Reynolds' place and answer, because of course the questions we want answered come from her personal recollection, so it's kind of hard for anyone else to speak for her. I think we are probably now waiting in particular for the internal review into how everything was handled and who knew what when, which is being undertaken by the head of the PM's department, Phil Gations, and the PM has indicated that he is willing for that to be made public. He has refused to say that it definitely will be, but I think there'll be significant enough pressure and expectation that whatever is found there, and if there are things found to be lacking, that it will be made public. So in terms of further answers, you never know. I mean, today in question time, it was actually revealed that Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton had received a briefing from the AFP on February 11, which is of course several days before the allegations went public. So there's still more sort of trickling out, and hopefully that report in particular will give us some much needed answers.
So you're confident that even though the Prime Minister is refusing to guarantee that he'll release that inquiry into what happened within his office, he said he'll wait and see until he gets it, you're still confident that there'll be full accountability and transparency there?
I wouldn't say confident at all, but I don't think that anything that he has said has been anything other than not knowing what he's committing to, and that it isn't, you know, not to verbal him, but to say that you're not sure what you're going to do. I genuinely believe in this case that that could mean that parts of this report will go public, and for it not to, or for a watered down or redacted version to go public, is just going to make this issue continue. There's no escaping it. We're into the second week now of this issue being the dominant discussion in this building, in our place of Parliament, and I think that he can't, on this occasion, put the report in a drawer somewhere and hope that everyone stops asking about it.
Vincent, when you hear, as we did yesterday when Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton was not willing to answer questions about whether or not the AFP had been in touch, as they should be, alerting him to any kind of politically sensitive matters. When you hear that, what as a police officer, what do you think?
First of all, I think it was appalling. How can a sexual assault of a woman be classified as politically sensitive? There's an offence under the Crimes Act, and all states and territories have it, of concealing a serious offence, and a sexual assault is considered a serious offence. If someone knows about it, the politicians are not above the law. The law says you must report it to the police. You have to report it to the police. Who made the law? You can't step above the law. They are not answerable to themselves. It's not a politically sensitive issue. It's a criminal law. It's the rule of law. And there's also a case by the High Court of Australia says that if people are willfully blind to something happening, that they refuse to look at it like an infant does, don't look at me, I can't see you, then they know that the crime has been committed, or it is implicit. So it beggars belief.
But you would have heard a lot of the way this is being discussed is that they said that some of the ministers have said Brittany Higgins did not want at that point to go to the police. Now, just talk me through, because I've had so many people ask me this question about, like, say, what if we did have Linda Reynolds, Michaelia Cash, Peter Dutton and the Prime Minister go to the police and say, look into this. This is number one priority. We really care. But we have a woman who's not willing to give testimony or press charges.
Okay. Every woman and every man, but particularly women who has been sexually assaulted, has the right to approach the police when they feel comfortable doing so. And some, as we well know, never do for whatever reason. But what I think is missing in this is that why has it been framed within the context of politics? It's a criminal offence, and she was never given due care in the very first instance, what we can put together by members of the Parliament, security, beg your pardon, and obviously politicians have known bits and pieces and have either chosen to ignore it or not even take the fundamental, duty of care to this lady. Yes, it's her prerogative not to go to the police if she doesn't want to, but no one is above the law. You know, it just, I am.
Right. Kerry, can I ask you, because there's been some senior Liberal women, former MPs like Amanda Vanstone, who said that Linda Reynolds, Michaelia Cash, it was a textbook response. They did all the right things, they've said. And Sid Marlis was indicating that last night on the drum as well. And yet, on the other hand, some are saying, well, if you had more women in the Liberal Party, this kind of stuff wouldn't happen and that would break down the culture.
I think what we need to actually do is look at this as a big picture issue, because this is not just within the Parliament, it's not just within the Liberal Party, it's an issue for us as a community to come to terms with. And we need to come to terms with the fact, and I'm sorry, Vincent, look, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to you thinking, well, then maybe I should have been charged, because women have disclosed to me. You know, I've had women disclose to me. I've never had a woman yet disclose to me who's wanted to go to the police.
Tell us why.
They disclosed they need to talk to someone. They want to talk to someone. They want to they want someone to be part of, oh my God, you know, why did this happen to me? That's what they want to do. Yeah. But then when as you can imagine, I'm so shy and retiring. I'm saying, come on, I'm here, take your hand here, and we're off to the police now. Yeah. And I've never had a woman who wanted to go to the police. And the reason is that, and there's all sorts of reasons, and they've been articulated in paper recently by people much more involved in these things than me. But there's a lot of shame. There is shame. There is. I mean, I don't want my family to know. I don't want, and I think in particular in this instance, and I have no reason to understand why Brittany has done it now when she didn't do it then. But the last thing you want in a workplace is to think that everybody's staring at you and talking about you,
or
and
concerns about losing a job.
And I think that's in any workplace. I don't think it's just.
But can I just bring you back to this question, because you're saying that's a broader issue and it's across society, and that's true, and we discuss it in many different forums on the drum. But isn't the point of being industry specific or workplace specific to say what is the particular culture here?
Yeah.
What is it like in the mining sector? What is it like in the media? Because it takes its own forms. So don't we need to drill down on political culture, especially male-dominated political culture, and say, even between the parties, there'll be different kinds of approaches.
And let me say, I think we should actually be saying to Brittany, thank God for you, Brittany, because you've actually made the most enormous wake-up call to the Parliament. Your very brave actions in doing what she's now doing have actually meant that all those inquiries, those 4 inquiries, are all going to hopefully come to some conclusion about what we do about the culture of Parliament House. My hope is that we have strong leadership which says it's not just the culture of Parliament House we need to do. We need to take these learnings from this, from these 4 inquiries, from the people involved. We need to put in place methods and mechanisms so that if someone does end up in that situation again, whether it's at work, in Parliament or at work elsewhere, that there's a process by which they can go through. They can feel as if they're being listened to. They can feel as if they're being supported. And I take your point. People need to know they're being supported, but often it will take them some time. It's not. Doesn't surprise me.
I want to bring in Sally Rugg. Sally, let's talk about intentions here. A lot of people saying that that Linda Reynolds was trying to do the right thing, that she was trying to protect her privacy and so on. How much does that matter?
I mean, it might be the case that Senator Reynolds was genuinely doing the best job that she knew how to, with the best of intentions to respect the privacy and autonomy of Brittany Higgins. That may be true. It may also be true that Senator Reynolds was thinking about the election that was about to be called. Or both things could be true. But going with, let's give Senator Reynolds the benefit of the doubt here. So she is doing everything she thinks is best practice. The reality is that it wasn't best practice, because Senator Reynolds is not a specialist in responding to sexual violence. And she doesn't have to be, because there are expert organisations who do this work. And so when Brittany Higgins came forward and spoke up, when she was called into that office and asked about what happened on the Saturday night prior, the moment that it became apparent that there might have been some sort of assault, that is the moment that experts in this field should have been called. And if I could just hold on to the conch and talk about why Brittany Higgins didn't go to the police.
Right.
Brittany's told us why she didn't go to the police. It was because she was made to feel that her job was in jeopardy, and that if she came forward with the allegations of what had happened to her, then it could be a political risk for the party that she so desperately wanted to work for and cared about. So Brittany didn't go to the police because, in her words, she was made to feel like there wouldn't be a job for her afterwards if she did so.
Aisha, I mean, we have all been quite consumed with the story. Every now and then a case of sexual assault or sexual harassment comes up and people become transfixed or enraged or confused or puzzled by this particular story because it seems to tell us something about the way our culture views women or views violence about women. Do you think
system as well?
Yeah, that's right. What questions do you have, and do you think this story has any kind of impact on women more generally, culturally?
But let's not be distracted by the fact that it wasn't just Parliament House, it was the Liberal Party specifically. And I think we need to be focused on certain facts here. I have a lot of questions about ministerial responsibility. Was what the minister did good enough? No, it wasn't. And we need to be levelled with, and I don't want to hear any excuses, because at the end of the day, we forget that they are public servants, which means that they serve us, the community, and they have a responsibility to us generally with the tone that they set and how they take accountability for their actions or lack of actions. And as Vince mentioned, the so-called Nelsonian eye, you know, it's what we call it in the law. You recklessly turn a blind eye when you ought to have known better. And in that case, I think that there could be some constructive... There's actually duty of care that was breached in this case. The other question is, she did not feel safe to come out because she felt like she had to choose between her job and her right to justice and to a remedy. And it's not just what happened on that night, it's all the things that happened leading up to that, the culture and the context. And coming back to ministerial responsibility, our taxpayer dollars actually pay for these ministers to do a job. Doesn't matter how hard it is, if there is a pending election. Right now, a lot of the rhetoric I see in the discussion is about, well, how can we basically save our backs in this case? It's about stepping up and doing what is expected morally and also legally.
I just want to say, Vincent, that Brittany Higgins has now formally lodged a complaint with police. We've had confirmation that that has occurred of a sexual assault by a male colleague. Now what happens?
So she'll give a statement to the police. The police will then gather CCTV, and once they've collected all the physical evidence, whether it be for the phones or CCTV, they'll then go and speak to the offender or the suspect. I just would like to say that it is very true that we expect a lot of our politicians, because we employ them. They don't employ us. We employ them to do a job. But it's within the context of politics that is really concerning. You know, Minister Dutton, a former police officer, should know that if a crime is reported to him, it's not politically sensitive. It's a human rights issue. It's got nothing to do with politics. And you can only draw the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that it's about damage control for politics.
Do you want to reflect on that, Claire
Would
Armstrong?
we say...
Oh, just quickly, I just want to bring Claire in, yes.
I think I could provide some clarity there. So basically what happens is, under the AFP's national guidelines, if there is a case that is deemed sensitive, they're obligated to inform the Minister of the day in charge, which in this case is Minister Dutton. And how we define sensitive is actually if it specifically involves a Member of Parliament or something connected to a politician, and also if it's deemed to be of interest to the Australian public. So Mr Dutton frequently gets briefed on cases that the AFP are investigating. The concern, or at least the confusion perhaps at the moment, is that the AFP, for whatever reason, chose to brief him for the first time about 2 weeks ago as opposed to almost 2 years ago. So on that level, I would say that, just to pick up what Sally was saying, because I think people are really confused about how politics bleeds into a case like this, and the simplest way I can explain it as someone that's in the building is, if you have this horrific experience in a law firm, in your place of work, in a bank, in a shop, and for whatever reason you either do or don't decide that the best form of justice for you is to go to the police, if it becomes public, any of those things, at some point you can leave that law firm, leave that company, and you can probably get a job in that field somewhere else. If you want to work for the Liberal Party, if you want to work for the Labor Party, and that is where you've worked toward for your entire life, there is no other Liberal Party, there is no other Labor Party. And that is a really important piece of context that I think goes into the decision-making process about going public or about going to the police, because if you risk that job, there isn't another place for you to do that particular career.
Were we given any reasonable explanation for why it took so long for the police to go to the Home Affairs Minister with the information?
I have asked the AFP for clarification as to why the matter was potentially deemed sensitive a couple of weeks ago and not originally. I am yet to have an answer on that one.
Okay. Sally, did you want to jump in and quickly say something there before we moved on?
Oh, I was going to say something catty about Peter Dutton, so it's probably best that you cut me off, to be honest.
Claire, thanks so much
Something about
for joining
Dutton,
us
human
tonight.
rights.
Can I just add to Claire's point about the disclosure of the reports?
Yeah.
It is absolutely not in anyone's interest, Liberal Party, Labor Party, any of the people involved, ministers or otherwise, to keep those reports away from the public. So I agree with Claire. I think that those reports will be made public, and I think in doing so, I hope that we end up getting a process, which I said earlier, a process by which people will feel confident about disclosing and having the appropriate legal actions taken.
Claire, thank you for coming on tonight.
Thanks for
Always
having me.
good to have your time and expertise. Claire Armstrong, she's a national political reporter at the Daily Telegraph. Now, you might have heard yesterday that JobSeeker, the unemployment payment, is set to rise by $50 a fortnight. But with that comes changes to what's known as mutual obligations, the requirements that job seekers have to fulfil in order to qualify for the payments, things like applying for a certain number of jobs a week. And now accepting jobs when they're offered, and if not...
What we will be doing for employers is introducing an employer reporting line, so that if someone does apply for a job, they're offered the job and they're qualified for the job, but they say no. The employer will now be able to contact my department and report that person as failing to accept suitable employment. And in the event they do not have a valid reason, they will be breached for that.
Now, business and welfare advocates have spoken out against what's being called a dobbing hotline and warning employers could abuse the system.
Imagine a circumstance where someone is treated badly at the interview, where they're harassed. Then you're saying that employer can dob in that unemployed woman for the fact that she's knocked back a job. I mean, this is dangerous territory to give power to employers to further punish people who are simply looking for work.
Most employers actually feel for the unemployed. We need to show compassion and support. You know a bludger when you see one, and the reality is that most unemployed people are not dull bludgers.
It wants to introduce a system which encourages a lack of trust and a culture of mistrust between people in the community.
A concern shared by many job seekers, including Rita McDonald, who's been unemployed since 2019.
I'm telling you, for people like me, COVID was actually a godsend because we got our payments doubled and we were able to feel a part of society. We could pay our rent, we could pay our bills. The announcement yesterday is cruel and insulting. What difference is $3.57 a day going to do? It's not going to do anything. They're imposing even more obligations on us. And I really hate the rhetoric of this mutual obligations, because there's nothing mutual about them. They are our obligations, job seeker obligations. The one that worries me the most is the intense training after 6 months on job seeker, spitting people out and putting them into places like aged care homes and working with the disabled when they shouldn't be working there. That's a very worrying one. But the most worrying one is the dob in, the dole bludger who won't take a job. Now, we all know there are hundreds of different reasons why people cannot take up a job, whether it's physically, mentally, it's you don't feel safe going to that job. What about the pay and conditions? So the employer can ring up and, you know, dob the dole bludger in, and so our payments get suspended.
Kerry, is this something that's actually required? There's employers who are saying they're really not certain that they need it or even that they would use it. We've got welfare advocates, job seekers.
So I think that there are certainly people out there who don't want to work. I think there's statistically you can show that there are people who are just not inclined to work. I think they're in the overwhelming minority. I think there are a very, very, very small number of people who sit on the unemployment.
But is there any evidence to suggest that there's been kind of, let's assume that there is a fraction of people who don't want to. Okay, if that's correct, is there any evidence that this is a net that would catch that group of people, or that there's any increase in that group of people, or we're not actually stigmatising a large group of people who lost their jobs during COVID?
What I was actually going to follow on by saying is that I don't think that this is going to do anything about that group of people at all, because my overwhelming view about these sorts of things, and look, I'm not sure where the idea came from, but my overwhelming view of these things is that Australians are not a nation of dobbers. We don't like dobbing in. We don't like dobbing in people. We might dob in the odd person who's throwing, rubbish out their window or is hooning around on the roads because they're dangerous. But we don't like dobbing. So I would be pretty well surprised if most employers, one, would think that they should do it, and two, would then take the time to do it. So I would like to think that what we would be better off doing is actually making sure that the people who are genuinely finding it hard to get a job, why can't they get a job? If this was a thing about policy, if this was about, look, I've had an employer, people come to me, I've had 5 people come to me in the last week, none of them want to work for me, but is it because my employment, where they're coming to work, my employment environment isn't conducive to them? What is it I can do as an employer to make sure that people will want to actually come and work with me? I think the other thing about it, and it'll be interesting to see whether this happens, is that I think people who don't get jobs, and who think, and for the reasons that we've heard, they were very uncomfortable in the interview, will they start ringing up and putting the employers in? I mean, that could be the way that it could backfire on the government. I'm not, look, I'm a big fan, as you know, I'm a big fan of Michaela Cash for a whole lot of things, but this one I'm not quite sure it's going to work the way they want it to.
It's, Aisha, you're currently on JobSeeker. Can you talk to us about how you think this might affect people who are looking for work?
Yeah, so being on JobSeeker means that I've got my own valid exemption, so I don't have to go through the typical mutual obligations. It's about 4 weeks ago I managed to finish my work placement to be pre-admission into the law. And so having something like being on JobSeeker is really helpful when you're working so hard and for free, and you're just about to enter into the workforce. And I also have a mother who has a disability for whom I care. She lives with me at home. So there are so many different factors that really play into why a person is on JobSeeker. And I think it's really difficult when people are stigmatised as well. Kerry, I totally agree with you on all those points that you mentioned. I personally think that this policy decision is doomed to fail. It will be ineffective. And can you imagine going into a job interview and then already being suspicious towards your potential employer? That's not very conducive to a very warm working relationship, one that's based on mutual trust and professionalism, thinking that, there might be reasons why you can't take on that work. At the moment, I manage 2 companies. I'm the chair of Roots TV. We do a lot of project-based contract work, which is also another reason why it's so difficult, because being in the arts and cultural industries, it's very up and down. And yes, we're getting a lot of support through the COVID-19 times. But being able to have that safety net in Australia is just a wonderful thing. I'm proud to be Australian. I'm proud to be part of a society that wants to give people a fair go. So if you start to put them in a box, that's going to be very detrimental. It's going to create a very toxic culture for everyone. The other thing also is it doesn't take a targeted approach. There might be a minority of people who genuinely are dole bludgers. But then why are we adopting a policy that really takes a collective punishment type approach?
Can you see any rationale to this, Vincent?
It's un-Australian.
Told you, we don't dob. We don't dob.
No, I can't. I would much rather see, after the robo debacle, I would rather see this money going to Lifeline or mental health issues. Simple as that.
1-800-RESPECT as well, which is another line we talk about. Sally, you're pulling a face there.
Oh, am I? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think the face I was pulling was, I've heard the word dole bludger a couple of times, and I think that, like, for people who are long-term unemployed and are really struggling to find the motivation to look for a job, like, I think it's really important that we don't use language like dole bludgers, because there's probably like some other stuff going on, and I think that's sort of really othering language. Yeah, this phone line is ridiculous. Like, what sort of miserable cretin of an employer would use this job, like, would dob someone in? I think any boss who uses that hotline to dob someone in is a bum. And I also think
channeling hawk. What if the information was used to identify employers that, what if like the same guy called up 50 times going, nah, won't take the job, nah, won't take, and you're like, hang on a minute, mate, you might have a problem.
But that's what I just said. I mean, it could actually come back and rebound. It could rebound on employers. It could actually end up that employers, people are ringing up saying, look, the reason I'm not taking a job with that guy, because according to this, they have to ring you, they contact you to brief you. And if they get 50 people have been to that guy and they're saying the guy's a complete sleaze and we don't want to be in the same office as him, it could rebound.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I think if
Sally.
Sorry.
I just this idea of a hotline, a dobbing hotline, it just so cruelly misunderstands what it's actually like to be a person seeking work. Like, yeah, the practicalities of it, the fact that there's just like physically not enough jobs that exist for people who need a job. So there's like the reality of the situation. But also if you're someone who perhaps you've lost your job or you've never been able to get into the workforce, to go through the process of searching for jobs, applying for jobs, getting rejected, picking yourself up, trying again. After you do this for a long period of time, it begins to grind you down in a really profoundly damaging way. And people who are seeking work for long periods of time can begin to question themselves, sort of like, what's wrong with me? Why is my life like this? Why is my life like this? Why doesn't anybody want me? So these feelings of sort of, lack of self-worth, of hopelessness, all underscored by the fact that most of these people are living in abject poverty, trying to decide whether they can pay for medication, pay for their food, make their rent. And so then to put upon these people this sort of cruel, perverse, really impractical measure of surveillance just casts these people who are resilient and hardworking and creative and doing their best as sort of criminals. It encourages people to treat them suspiciously and like we've got a dob on them. It's awful.
It goes back to the question of trust, as we were talking about before. You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Director of Government Relations firm Coercive and Associates, and former New South Wales Liberal leader Kerry Coercive, former police officer and lecturer at the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University, Vincent Hurley, in Melbourne, Executive Director of Change.org, Sally Rugg, and in Perth, founder of Modest Fashion Australia and chair of Roots TV, Aisha Novakovic. Now, recently on this program, we've been discussing what constitutes domestic violence and how that definition goes way beyond physical abuse alone. Now, think about things like placing limits on a partner's spending, dictating what they wear, secretly reading their text messages. All of these actions could amount to what's known as a pattern of behaviour that's coercive control.
He gets the kids to tell him who I see and where I go. He complains that I don't call him enough, then that I call him too much. He gets into my email and deletes things, and he sends messages from my account.
You're a useless mother. You get everything wrong. You're losing it.
Now, that's a video produced by Scottish Women's Aid, which was instrumental in drafting laws in Scotland criminalising coercive control. They came into force in 2018, and domestic violence experts have described them as gold standard. Now a New South Wales inquiry is considering its own law and hearing evidence from those who've experienced coercive control directly.
Some time ago, my kind and gentle friend was brutally murdered by her husband. His final act of control was his first of physical violence. My friend had been subjected to years of what I now identify as coercive control. For a long time, my friend, while regarding his behaviour as unreasonable and unacceptable in the absence of physical violence, did not perceive it as abuse.
I was continuously monitored, financially abused, psychologically abused, controlled and manipulated. The fear, the confusion, the isolation, the struggles were all part of a grand plan by the perpetrator. The courts sent him home to re-offend on numerous occasions. The police weren't educated on the complexities of how his mind worked, as he manipulated them as well. I lost everything I'd worked for.
While many are clearly suffering, some police and legal advocates are cautioning against making comparisons with Scotland's experience, suggesting a new criminal offence could overburden already stretched services. So we spoke to the Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid to find out what it takes to make laws like these work.
Does the new law allow for the system to respond to more elements of the abuse that children and women are experiencing? And the answer to that is emphatically yes. Actually, I was in a meeting just last week where one of the prosecutors was laying out essentially what the police say to the prosecution service when they say there was a crime committed and this is what we think it is. What this prosecutor did was indicate all of the things that would never have been able to be charged in that case prior to the implementation of our new law. And that was about 80%. And it was some of the most horrifying things about controlling the everyday lives, micromanaging the everyday lives of the women involved in the charges. During the year between the time the act was passed and implementation, all of the sheriffs and judges in Scotland were trained about the new law on coercive control. Thousands of police officers were trained, and some of that is still going on. There were many, many, many things happened. The Crown Office did special training for their prosecutors, etc. All of that needs to keep going. The reality is that there's so much evidence that says a one-off training doesn't change behavior. People know things differently, but they don't act differently. There has been really concerted efforts by Police Scotland to improve the quality of policing around domestic abuse. You know, to move away from the, oh, it's just a domestic, and if we separate them and, you know, take him down and drop him off at the pub, then or somewhere else, that, you know, that we've done our job and we can move on to the real crime. And I was interviewing Chief Constable of Strathclyde Police. And one of my questions for him was, what made Strathclyde Police, who are a real leader in this area, decide to change the way it policed around domestic abuse? And I thought it was a really telling answer. He said, well, it's not like we woke up in the morning suddenly and had an epiphany. It's what the women in the community have been telling us for years, and when we started to take a look at what explained the murders and what explained, you know, a huge amount of the crime in our community, you know, so much of the trail led back to domestic abuse. And so it became clear to them that actually it was their job, and along with a couple of other things, possibly the most important part of their job.
Now, Vincent, this is something that you worked on for a long time in the area of domestic violence. And you've described before how in one single night you can have as many as 20 incidents that you might attend, and all the stress that that can bring when you're a police officer trying to discern what's going on and making everyone safe. At the same time, that is very much an incident-based culture, right? So if we're going to make a shift or contemplate making a shift where we're trying to establish patterns of behaviour over a period of time, which so many survivors say is more pertinent, what does that mean for police?
First of all, it's going to mean more time investigating the crime, but it's a retrospective crime. So the police will still go to domestic, arrest the baddie, take them back to the police station and charge them. But it means that, you know, in the weeks following, that the police have to go back and sift through all the records, and it is going to be really labour intensive, and it's going to be very costly to the department, the police department, because they've got finite resources. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It will need a degree of education for sure, but I think with a lot of changes within the police or law, it will change over time. It will become a normative part of police work where it will just be automatically done. But it is very labour intensive.
Do we have the resources for that? I mean, we know that this is the majority of police work, right?
Yep.
Is it 60% or so in New South Wales? I've heard reports of 80% in Victoria.
Yeah,
it's huge.
Yeah, it was between 700 to 1,000 domestics in Australia per day.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a staggering amount. So it's going to be labour intensive, but even if it saves one life, it's worth it. Absolutely. And there's no reason why it can't be done. I've read a number of articles on the New South Wales parliamentary website. It says that there's pause for thought about implementing this. And I was gobsmacked. Why would you pause for thought when one woman is murdered every 9 days about domestic violence?
Well, the New South Wales Police were kind of saying there's need for caution, because of the low prosecution and conviction rates in other places.
I don't swallow that, because it's been in Victoria, it's been in Tasmania now since the late 2000s, and I dug out a report from the Tasmanian Police. So since 2008 to last year, there's been 253 charges of coercion against offenders. So 253. Now, that is telling in itself that it actually does work. Yes, it will take time to implement. Yes, it will take resources. Yes, the police will need training.
And I'm interested in this too, because I was looking up some of the things that police in the UK are now trained to ask. Is there anything your partner asks you to do that makes you feel ashamed? What is the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning? And do you think there'll be consequences if you defy your partner? More of a kind of a hostage entrapment situation.
Yeah, it is. And police will have to go back through, and I've written some notes here, back through SMSs, on WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, emails, phone records, and that's going to take time. So even if the victim doesn't want to, or for whatever reason, is hesitant to look at it or to comply, there's really nothing stopping the police going and gathering those records and introducing them into court. What the good thing about the law is that the behaviour of an individual now has been isolated, it's been siloed, where before it was used to explain the ultimate offence of assault or domestic violence or murder. But now, because it's been isolated, these individual incidences are themselves part of an additional crime.
Right.
So, again, sorry.
Right. No, I want to ask Kerry your view as well, because I know that you're involved with Our Watch. Yeah. And they too have, expressed support for the need for examination of this closely, but also concern about some unintended consequences.
Yeah, look, I think one of the concerns, particularly in the Indigenous community, is that there might be unintended consequences for the Indigenous community, because there's the rates of domestic violence within Indigenous communities are higher than in the broader community anyway, but there are concerns that these laws might work against the interest of women in those communities. So what Our Watch, My position as
Which
a
is an
director,
advocacy group for domestic violence.
We're an advocacy group for the prevention of domestic violence, and so I think within the organisation, the fact that this is being talked about, anything which raises awareness of the types of behaviour that domestic violence involves is a good thing. You said at the beginning at your introduction that it's people think it's about the fact that he slapped her or he took a knife to her or he killed her. It's actually much more than that. And women do live in those situations for a very long time. Yeah. And one of your quotes was from a woman who said her friend was killed and that was the first act of violence he'd actually used against her friend. So I think the fact that we're talking about it is a very good thing. I think we need to make sure that anything we introduce, there's absolutely no point, Vincent, introducing a law which can't be enforced. So, if we are to introduce...
You mean if there's low rates of conviction, if there's low rates of charging it all?
Yeah, if there's not enough ability to investigate, if there's not enough to take it through the courts, and if there's not the resources that women need to be supported through those processes.
Yeah, but that was... Those arguments as well were also used when marital rape was criminalised. They said, we'll never be able to track it down. It's between husband and wife. We'll never be able to get enough evidence and there'll be low rates of conviction. No, and there have been. Yeah, there are low rates of conviction. It's still not a law that works perfectly, but you know what I mean? I don't dispute that this behaviour takes place. Absolutely, we all know too many cases where it has taken place. The only problem I would have would be, if you heard from the Scottish example, we must make sure that when we introduce these laws that they just don't sit on the books. Yep. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't use them. Yep. I'm saying, just don't pass laws and have them sit on the books. If you're going to pass these laws, then I think there needs to be the commitment from governments and police services and everybody else to make sure that they are effectively introduced and then used. That's what I'm saying. Yep. Aisha, you've advised governments on this very issue. How do you think we should be approaching it?
Yes, I have been listening to the conversation and when I came across this morning, coercive control, look, it's important to identify it as part of the pattern of abusive behaviour. I myself have experienced domestic violence, the very physical forms of DV. And so I understand why it's really important to have laws in place. I've dealt with a lot of police officers, some great, some had a lot to be desired. Some that have come in and just after I've been strangled said there was no evidence to take it any further, because that was usually the main way that I experienced DV. And it's funny because in America, crimes like strangulation in the context of DV are seen as attempted homicide. But I'm highlighting this as an example that we already have that in our criminal code here in WA. And yet what happens afterwards? So say you get a really good cop who rocks up, who's really compassionate, understands everything, does the interview, does the police report, presses the charges. The real battlefield is in the courts. And I'll be very honest with you, we currently have judges and magistrates on the benches making decisions who either shouldn't be there, should be trained a lot more, or training is ineffective, or they're resistant to training, because there's something about DV and the psyche, the psychology, the impact, the PTSD, it's very complex. For women like me who understand it, we get it. And in some ways, we probably recognise it really intuitively. And the solutions are probably more apparent to us than to others. So my question is, if we've got finite resources to beat this, then does this become, another distraction? I'm not diminishing its value, maybe its symbolic power. But in terms of practicality, on the ground solutions, I think about the children who are impacted. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, Aisha.
I always get triggered.
Oh,
God, this wasn't meant to happen.
Yeah, of course. We'll just give you a
it's
little
all good.
moment.
I just get fed up because this talk, is it really saving lives? Tell me. All this debate. You can create 10 more offences, but what happens when it gets legally prosecuted or you don't even get a fair chance to get a legal advocate?
or there's not enough legal aid funding. Let's put the money where it actually makes impact rather than creating laws and live in this illusion that we're actually saving lives. Let's get real. Let's look at local solutions. And I know it's all about evidence. We need to have that evidence, but I want to know what happens at the pointy end of town. Because there are all of these pressure points in the system and there's an entire system failure here. So we're doing all the talking, which is fantastic. Meanwhile, someone's getting killed, or by this time next week, we've lost about 2 more women. And there are children in our communities who suffer for decades because we haven't identified the correct solutions. And yes, I'm from the legal profession, and I can tell you right now, they have a long way to go.
Aisha, does it give you any... I completely get what you're saying. You know, like, in terms of domestic violence and all the things that need to be done, and there's no simple answer and resources are needed. And does it give you any comfort that this is something that so many kind of survivors say will help identify perpetrators better if it's not incident-based, and that if we look at what's happened in Scotland, for example, there's been an 81% conviction rate. And 95% haven't even had to go through the court system. They were settled, which means that a lot of victims don't have to get re-traumatised. Does that even indicate to you that that could be a good way? I know we're just talking about it at the moment, and that's what we do.
Are you asking me this question?
You, Aisha, yeah.
Look, I think that's promising in a lot of ways. However, I'm just wondering what that does on a daily basis. I'll give you an example. I work at the grassroots level where there are lots of people I know who've also experienced and survived domestic violence, not just as women, and there are men as well, but particularly with the children. Often, if there is a VRO in place, often it's the woman that removes that VRO. And a lot of people don't understand why. There are lots of reasons. It's another conversation maybe for another show. Yep. But it does happen. A lot of women refuse to press charges. Hey, that's the father of my child. There's all kinds of reasons. Fear of safety, of repercussions. Often there's reconciliations. You get trapped in this cycle. You can be a really strong woman. Like I consider myself, you know, back in the day when I was a teenager, I was really feisty. And then one day you just wake up 2 years later, you don't even know who you are. And you're, you know, your family's falling. But it's difficult. Sometimes it's women who intervene in that process themselves. Right. So when Kerry was talking about, you know, emphasising prevention, that's really important. It's also the support throughout the process. It's about getting the right legal help as well. Yeah. So I think the resources can be directed better in all sorts of areas. And women's refuges, another thing. I mean, where do you go for safety and trust? Yeah.
It's interesting what you talk about in terms of symbolic change as well, and how do you get a shift in a conversation? Are some people saying that's happening in England and Scotland and Wales? There've been more publicity of, you know, coercive control cases and more discussion around it. You know, a lot of people saying now there's need for wholesale cultural change, and this is something that FKA Twigs, I think, really highlighted when we talk about the need for cultural change in the way we talk about and understand domestic abuse. And she was asked recently in an interview about her experience of abuse, and she said this.
And nobody who's been in this position likes this question, and I often wonder, is it even an appropriate question to ask? Mm-hmm. And you know the question is, why didn't you leave?
Yeah. And I think we just have to stop asking that question. I know that you're asking it, like, out of love, but, like, I'm just gonna make a stance and say that I'm not gonna answer that question anymore, because the question should really be to the abuser, why are you holding someone hostage with abuse? You know, and people say, oh, it can't have been that bad because else you would have left. And it's like, no, it's because it was that bad, I couldn't leave.
So that's a huge shift, isn't it, Sally? The number of times, even as I've reported on cases of domestic violence, it's almost the number one question people ask me. Why don't people leave? Instead of understanding how women particularly, because it's usually women in this situation, can be in a situation they feel they cannot leave.
And I think this is a really important part of this conversation that the nation is hopefully having around coercive control and emotional abuse, because until you've experienced that kind of abuse, or until someone you love has experienced that kind of abuse, it can be very difficult to understand what it is, and that difficulty to understand is what leads to questions like, well, he didn't hit you, did he? Or, well, why didn't you leave? Or why do you keep going back to him? I think, I really sympathise with a lot of what Aisha was saying around, it's just talk. But what I do hope is that by talking about it, particularly on platforms like this, that there'll be people watching at home who hear the message that you shouldn't feel afraid of your partner, and you shouldn't feel like you are walking on eggshells in your own home. And those are the sorts of messages that accompany conversations about the technicalities and the specifics of what emotional abuse is and what coercive control is. And I think the more we talk about this, the more people will realise that they're in these situations, because it's very common for women to not realise that they're in emotionally abusive situations. Hannah Baxter, for instance, she told her parents she didn't believe that she was in an abusive situation.
Can I just say that, we talk about cultural change, and that has to be the number one thing that we're aiming at in this space, which is why Our Watch does the work that we're doing, which is about prevention, because we will not stop domestic violence until we stop men and women understanding that there are no designated roles. Boys don't do this, girls don't do this. Men don't have a natural superiority because they're bigger, they're bigger and faster and quicker. We need to have a community in which we absolutely believe that gender roles are not defined by male and female, but they're defined by, what we need to do is have a community where we define ourselves as equals. And until we get to the stage where it is not acceptable for people to demean women, it's not acceptable for boys to make smart-ass remarks about their little sisters. Until we get to that stage, then we will continue to have domestic violence, because it is about recognising that the gender inequality still exists in our community, even in an informed, compassionate, open community that we like to regard ourselves as in Australia.
Right. Vincent, could I ask you to just quickly respond to what Aisha was saying and that kind of really strong sense of frustration?
I think when you respond to domestic violence socially or even within the police, I think victims look for different triggers to relate to or try to pull themselves out of that relationship, that there has to be a suite of measures, because people identify with different aspects of, well, I need to do this or I can't do that. I don't think, it's not a one-size-fits-all response for victims at all. What I might respond to will be different from what you or Alicia might respond to. So
there's so much to do on so many levels. I just want to say, if you need to support, call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. And Aisha, I just want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. I'm really sorry that affected you. I have so much respect. No, honestly, I have so much respect for you.
100 years later, and it's still a touchy point. So,
yeah,
but you move on, and with time you can heal. And I think that's the takeaway for me. Yes, the law is there to help. We need cultural change, gender equality, all of that. But at the end of the day, a woman has her agency. She can find healing.
And we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. All of our panel, Aisha, Sally, Vincent, Kerry, thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. And wokeism next time.